Men travel far to see a city, but few seem curious about a river. Every river has, nevertheless, its individuality, its great silent interest. Every river has, moreover, its influence over the people who pass their lives within sight of its waters. H.S. Merriman.
I believe, as now informed, the Cuyahoga will be the place. It must command the greatest communication, either by land or water, of any river, or I am no prophet. Moses Cleveland.
They came to the Cuyahoga Valley with a dream, the dream of a better life on the new frontier. There were Irish, Germans, Hungarians, Poles, Greeks, and Ukrainians. Together, they built a city which today stands as a testament to their sacrifice, work, energy, and strength. They settled on the flat land on both banks of the Cuyahoga River and began to build a nation.
The northeast portion of Ohio was originally known as Connecticut's Western Reserve. It was land owned by the state of Connecticut, and it extends for 120 miles westward from the Pennsylvania border. The land was sold by the state to a group of private investors, and Moses Cleveland being the general agent for that group. And they came out here in the summer of 1796 to examine the area and survey it and lay it out into townships. The crew worked in this area and various other areas. He returned to Connecticut later that summer and never came back again. There were a couple of settlers who remained here. Back into the 18th century, the area was considered significant both by George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. They felt that the Cuyahoga River held great future importance for the new country, both from an economic standpoint and from a military standpoint, because of course at that point what is now Canada was occupied by European nations.
The few remaining settlers were a rough bunch. Under the harsh conditions of frontier life, they had to be tough. It was said to settle in the Cuyahoga Valley was almost an invitation to settle in one's grave. If Moses Cleveland was the most important of the valley's early characters, Lorenzo Carter had to be its most colorful.
The best way to remember Lorenzo Carter is that he was a frontiersman and a businessman. But he basically ran a fur trading and sort of early, very rustic tavern in the flats on the east side of the river. So what's important about that is he didn't particularly want settlers to come. What he wanted was to control the fur trade and to profit from and benefit from that. So he helped himself by supplying food and whiskey, so we're told, to a band of, says the letter in 1802, desperados who basically controlled the flats area and were known, and it became to be known as the area under the hill.
A man of action, Carter came to be viewed with something close to awe by his Indian neighbors. It seems that Carter sold watered-down whiskey to the Indians, who became outraged and descended on his cabin. Alerted to the fact that the Indians were intoxicated, Carter met them with a poker and masterfully beat back the attack. His fame spread, and soon his cabin became a gathering place as village inn, jail, courthouse, and wedding chapel. Early growth was slow and disease rampant. The harbor remained unimproved because there was no money and less interest. Merchants took shameful advantage of the settlers by charging exorbitant prices for basic commodities. Little wonder then that by 1810, there were only 57 residents. Soon, however, this would all change due to a natural calamity half a world away.
In 1816, there was in New England a season or a year where there was no summer. It was called the year with no summer. They didn't know that, but the reason why there was no summer was because of a volcanic eruption of Krakatoa in the Pacific Ocean, which, if you recall, Mount St. Helens, and what it did, it sort of put volcanic ash into and reduced the temperature right around there. Well, Krakatoa was such a huge one, it reduced the temperature so much there was literally frost every month of the year. The people in Massachusetts, especially religious ones, thought this was God's word telling them that there was a problem with New England. And many of them, starting in 1817, came to the Western Reserve, and lots of other places, but came out to the Western Reserve and began, in some ways, the biggest influx in the Flats area and in Cleveland in general.
The influx of new settlers cleaned up Cleveland's tarnished reputation. No longer would it be known as the godless, unruly village of its frontier days. Churches and schools opened. Children were civilized with lessons from the Bible on Sunday, and in reading, appearance, and behavior the rest of the week. Newcomers took over the running of the town, passing ordinances to keep cows and pigs off the streets, and rowdies from discharging their guns in public.
Cleveland is a thriving town with 9 stores and 3 taverns. There are 6 vessels owned in Cleveland, constantly sailing the lakes. Merchandise of all kinds can be bought. Jesse Harris, 1824.
Alfred Kelly, the father of the Ohio-Erie Canal, persuaded the Canal Commission to locate the northern terminus for the canal where the Cuyahoga River empties into Lake Erie. Cleveland became the commercial and transportation center of the new frontier.
The Ohio and Erie Canal was the first canal constructed west of the Alleghenies. The Erie Canal in New York was constructed in the early 1820s, and many of the workers who worked on that project, such as Irish immigrants, then came to Ohio and worked on the Ohio and Erie Canal. The stretch between Cleveland and Akron opened in 1827, and the entire canal was opened between Lake Erie and the Ohio River in 1832. This opened up the New York markets and northeast portion of the United States to the agricultural crops that could be grown in Ohio and in this portion of the Midwest.
Kelly supervised the construction of the canal, which cost less per mile than any of its kind in Europe or America. 308 miles long, 40 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, it was dug by immigrants using shovels, picks, and wheelbarrows. Laborers were paid $5 a month, given a place to sleep and a daily whiskey ration. The industrial boom had begun.
When the canals were opened up, Cleveland became an industrious, booming city. For the first time, Cleveland was linked not only with other cities via the lake, but also from the Ohio River region, which was an industrial center. Goods and services were moved up and down the canal and into the Cleveland area.
Congress recognized the Flats' commercial importance and appropriated $5,000 to accommodate increased shipping.
There finally was federal money to open up the river. And what they did was to clear it out and make it a real port. What they did was they dammed the Cuyahoga River up. And then all at once, they let the water that had been dammed up go. It rushed straight out to the lake, and it cleaned out the sandbars. It allowed for a port after 1825 to develop in Cleveland, in the Flats, because the river was now cut to the lake and sailing and steam vessels could come in to the river.
The completion of the canal and improvements to the harbor and port pushed Cleveland up from its frontier roots into the whirlwind of the Industrial Revolution. In the mid-1830s, a rivalry developed between Cleveland on the east side of the river and Ohio City on the west. The people of Ohio City were proud that they were the first to bridge the Cuyahoga with floating logs chained together. In 1836, the village of Cleveland opened the Columbus Street Bridge, a 200-foot covered drawbridge. Declaring the Ohio City Bridge a nuisance, Clevelanders took it apart in the dark of the night. Outraged, the citizens of Ohio City tried to blow up the drawbridge. The Battle of the Bridges was engaged.
This led to civil unrest in the summer of 1837, which brought out the Ohio militia eventually to quell the unrest. Several of the rioters were injured seriously. Cleveland brought out one of their old cannons and fired cannon shots off towards Ohio City. And Ohio City had a cannon emplacement near the Columbus Road Bridge, and they would fire cannon shots over into a pig farm area and splatter mud everywhere as the cannon shot would hit the mud. It would cause quite a mess. A lot of the Bridge War facts are probably more legend than anything else.
The feud was resolved when Cleveland summarily annexed its cross-river rival in 1858. By 1850, Cleveland's population had reached 44,000, half of them immigrants. As the well-to-do left the flats for upscale housing along the heights of the valley, poor immigrant laborers took their place under the hill. These new arrivals from Europe filled the labor pool created by Cleveland's changing economy.
Many of them were Germans, and also a very significant number of them were Irish. The Germans did not generally settle in the flats. The Irish, however, did settle in the flats. Generally, they settled on the west side of the flats. And the reason for that was the most inexpensive housing was available in this area because it wasn't desirable for people who could afford to live other places.
And they did come for the most part as displaced agricultural workers looking to literally readapt themselves and their abilities to a new kind of environment, the urban and American setting. And they came mainly to work on the docks. By the 1850s, Cleveland had, of course, had the canal and the river, and at that point the lake shipment as well. So there's an awful lot of transport of goods coming together in one place there in the flats. And all of the transfer of commodities, particularly bulk commodities like coal and very soon iron ore from the upper Great Lakes, and timber especially, lots and lots of timber. All of that movement from ship to shore and shore to ship was accomplished by hand. And it was that work that the bulk of the Irish in the flats did. Of course, in the walking city, as it's called, people did live very near their work, and that was the flats.
The hard-working, hard-drinking Irish lived in tar paper shanties in an area on the west bank of the river known as the Angle. It soon had a reputation as one of the wildest places in the city.
There was undoubtedly alcohol to be had in quantity in the flats, and there were certainly some riotous good times and bad. To the extent, to what extent those were the products of residents, and to what extent they were the products of some of the editorializers coming down into the flats for a good time, it's very difficult to tell. Archaeologically, we've found something interesting about the Irish residents, in that in the debris we recover from the refuse disposal, household refuse disposal, we find surprisingly little that's directly related to the consumption of alcohol.
This closely knit Irish neighborhood overlooking the ore docks of the Cuyahoga was the birthplace of men who went on to great achievements. Men like industrialist Tom Patton, president of Republic Steel, and boxing champion Johnny Kilbane. But as the 20th century approached, the shanties were replaced by warehouses in the economic revitalization of the city. Once again, as the flats changed, so did the valley.
One other development that's going to happen that's going to change the flats and Cleveland and affects us nationally is the transition from canals to railroads, which were faster and more efficient. By 1852, Cleveland had committed itself to and had railroad connections between itself and most eastern cities.
The flats made the Cuyahoga Valley the crossroads for the shipment of raw materials. Iron ore came from the Great Lakes, and coal from Ohio and Pennsylvania. By boat and by rail they came, bringing prosperity. No longer the frontier trading post, Cleveland now took its place as an industrial giant, just as Moses Cleveland had predicted.
One of the first major forces that propelled industrial growth in the Cuyahoga Valley was the Civil War. The foundries and other metal-related plants that were here turned out many products for the Union forces, such as rolling stock for railroads, locomotives, rails.
Bloodshed and prosperity mix well, wrote one historian. While more than 1/4 of Cleveland's militia were casualties of the Civil War, Union money poured into the flats for the machines of battle.
Iron ore has been discovered in Michigan. It's already being brought across the lake before the Civil War. Blast furnaces are already in Cleveland before the war. And some of Cleveland businesses are already supporting the railroads, the expansion of railroads, making not only locomotives, but also railroad ties and irons, the rails that allow the railroads to go. So when the Civil War happens, more of this production, the production is increased, but it's already there. Cleveland's in an ideal position, far from the battle, but close to and already set up to create railroads, rails, and most of this production, in fact, probably all of it, occurs in the flats.
The 1860s saw the rise of entrepreneurs and industrialists who made huge fortunes out of the businesses they began in the flats. John D. Rockefeller invested the money he made from selling commodities to the Union Army in a new petroleum refining company called Standard Oil. By 1880, Rockefeller was worth over $18 million, and by 1882, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the nation's refining capacity. As his small chemical company grew with the emerging oil industry, Eugene Griselli, an Italian immigrant, built a plant to manufacture sulfuric acid for the refiners. When Griselli Chemical merged with E.I. DuPont de Nemours in 1928, they created one of the world's largest chemical companies, DuPont. The Flats was home to pioneers in the paint business, Henry A. Sherwin and Edward P. Williams. Sherwin-Williams revolutionized the industry by introducing ready-mixed paint. This success led them to expand their riverfront manufacturing and warehouse facilities. In 1866, another entrepreneur, Thomas H. White, relocated his extensive business operations to the Flats.
The White family had far-flung enterprises. During the mid-20th century, they were best known for things like trucks, but they initially started out making sewing machines and produced over 100,000 a year. They then, several of the children in the firm started a company that made White steam-powered automobiles that were also manufactured in the plants. And across the river was a Hungarian immigrant, Joseph Kuntz, who had a factory that made all of the cabinets for the sewing machines and even at one point made wooden automobile bodies.
By this time, the Flats ranked third in the country in shipping, supported by the ample supply of skilled labor, extensive machine tooling, and iron and steel industries. These giants were not alone along the riverfront. Smaller industries such as garment makers, lumber yards, barrel makers, and greenhouses dotted the landscape.
The smoke of prosperity mingled with the odor of hemp and canvas oil and grease. The air was filled with hoarse blasts from steamship whistles, the clang of ships' bells, and the hoot of tugs and locomotives. Industry was making men rich.
Prosperity came to some, but not to all. By 1890, 3/4 of the city were first or second generation Americans. For many, the search for a better life in America ended with dehumanizing work, poverty, and despair.
With the development of Cleveland as an industrial city, of course, we had a tremendous amount of pollution, both in the air and in the water, particularly in the Cuyahoga River. City officials in the 1880s described the river at that time as an open cesspool.
Attempts to prevent further pollution of the river were met with angry denunciations and were viewed by most as a threat to the economy. Though the voices warning of environmental disaster were drowned out by the chorus promoting profits, one group did manage to send a message into the future, lamenting the plight of their city.
We bequeath to you a city of a century, prosperous and beautiful, and yet far from our ideal. Some of our streets are not well lit. Some are unpaved. Many are unclean. Many of our people are poor, and some are vainly seeking work at living wages. Some of our children are robbed of their childhood. Vice parades our streets, and disease lurks in many places.
In the coming years, Cleveland would strive to overcome the problems of the industrial age. In the first decade of the 20th century, the city's population almost doubled to over 500,000. Cleveland was the sixth largest American city. The population explosion gave impetus to a bridge-building frenzy. Most were low-level drawbridges, which were raised and lowered constantly to allow for the flow of traffic on the Cuyahoga River. While a great engineering achievement when it opened in 1878, the superior viaduct's inefficiency made it almost immediately obsolete.
The structure was a stone arch bridge with a large wooden and iron swing span, which pivoted on the column in the center of the river. And when a tall ship came, the bridge tender would swing the bridge, operated by ropes and pulleys, to provide for the passage of tall ships. Unfortunately, when this bridge was opened in 1878, there was just a tremendous volume of horse and buggy and wagon traffic, as well as streetcars, that needed to use this crossing. And every time they moved the bridge to open it up, it took about 10 minutes each direction. So you're talking a 20-minute wait.
Finally, in 1917, the first high-level bridge was built. The Detroit Superior was the largest double-deck bridge in the world, rising a spectacular 96 feet above the water. The upper deck was for automobiles, the lower for streetcars. By 1930, it earned the title of America's busiest, carrying over 70,000 cars a day.
Cleveland, once so aptly called the Forest City, now should be known as the City of Bridges.
The Flats at the turn of the century was an unsightly mix of warehouses, factories, bars, and shanties. While the rest of Cleveland enjoyed the good brought by the Industrial Revolution, the Flats suffered with the bad. A champion was needed, and into that role stepped Tom L. Johnson. With a self-made fortune, he was elected mayor in 1901 and found that he had to battle his own social class to make improvements.
For the greater part of 9 years while Johnson was mayor, Cleveland was an armed camp. There was but one line of division. It was between those who would crucify Mr. Johnson and those who would believe in him. If any kind of cruelty, any kind of coercion, Any kind of social, political, or financial power was left untried in those years to break the heart of Mr. Johnson and all his friends. I don't know what or when it was. Frederick C. Howell.
Mayor Johnson gained an international reputation for fighting the problems of the industrial age. His personal fortune was sacrificed to public service, and he became known as the best mayor of the best-governed city in America. He was defeated in his bid for a fifth term and died 2 years later. Other industrialists took up his mantle and organized the first campaign of its kind to raise funds for social services. It became a model for the Red Cross and United Way. The new relief agencies were in place and ready when, in 1913, the Flats suffered the worst flood in Ohio's history. The Cuyahoga River rose 20 feet above flood stage and washed all the lumber stacked in the flats into Lake Erie. Lumber companies paid scavengers to reclaim the millions of feet of lumber floating in the lake. The Flats survived the flood and prospered during World War I and the Roaring Twenties. What it could not survive was the flight of middle-class families, leaving their housing to be subdivided, neglected, and ultimately abandoned.
Mostly people don't live there anymore at all. After the 1930s, almost no one lives in the flats anymore. And still the bars are there, but fewer bars than there have been because fewer people work in the flats than did before. And those people who work come out of the flats quickly. They don't come up toward the lake and go up. They come up back and forth to their houses up on the plateaus because the industry's taken the whole flats down, south of the bridge. And as that happens, the flats becomes almost like it was after the Lorenzo Carter era, a backwater a little bit. Less important, the least important, I guess, of any of its history.
When the Depression hit, it hit hard. Unemployment soared to over 50%, and businesses cut production. The Flats' industrial power was gone, its age of domination over.
One of the more colorful aspects of Cleveland's history, of course, was during the Depression, when rum runners would ferry whiskey across Lake Erie from Canada, of course try to get away from city officials, as well as the FBI, who were in operation here in Cleveland enforcing those prohibition laws. Many of the smaller boats would come across the lake and land at Whiskey Island in the flats at the mouth of the Cuyahoga River. There would be boats waiting for the other boats coming in with whiskey, which would take the illegal stuff down the river, or maybe there'd be trucks waiting on the island, which would disappear into the city environs once they got their cargo.
The head of Republic Steel, Cyrus Eaton, said that Cleveland was hurt more by the Depression than any other city. As did other businessmen, he and his partner, William G. Manther, used this time to reposition their firm and modernize. They merged with smaller companies to form the nation's third largest steel manufacturer. Republic Steel was a pioneer and the world's largest producer of alloy and stainless steel. But labor problems increased as attempts were made to unionize. The disputes reached a boiling point in 1937 with the Little Steel Strike, when hundreds of workers were injured and 2 were killed. Still, Republic became one of the biggest employers in the flats, with a workforce of over 9,000. Even during the Depression, the petroleum industry was able to grow. Gulf, Shell, and Sinclair all built new facilities in the flats, and it became one of the largest oil refining areas in the country. But one of the most successful ventures belonged to Hector Boiardi. His carry-out spaghetti operation became so large it required assembly line production. The spaghetti's popularity grew to the point that Boiardi canned it to be sold in stores, put his picture on the label, and named it Chef Boiardi.
At the time in the 30s, Cleveland was dramatically hit by hard times. There was a large transient population that would ride the rails. People were homeless. They were looking for jobs in the industries, many of which had closed up or had cut back operations. So we had the homeless, we had the poor who were ready to lose their homes, and with the construction of the public housing, people had a place to live, particularly young couples and young families who couldn't afford to own a home or couldn't afford to pay rent. They sought refuge in the public housing.
Elliot Ness of Chicago's Untouchables fame came to Cleveland in 1934 to help clean up the corrupt police department and fight organized crime. As safety director, his reputation for integrity and incorruptibility seemed unassailable, until an elusive murderer wrought havoc in the flats.
In 1935, decapitated bodies started to appear in the Kingsbury Run Flats area, and bodies were discarded in and around some of the bridges as well as by some of the railroad tracks. Later on, as the killings became more prevalent, the bodies were found in other areas of the city near the flats and along the lakefront. At this time, Elliot Ness was the safety director for the city of Cleveland. He came here in 1935, and he spent much of his career trying to solve the torso killing mystery, as you might say, because the killer was never apprehended.
Frustrated, Ness questioned over 5,000 people, and in an act of desperation, burned down a shantytown in an attempt to find the killer. The torso butcher murdered and dismembered a dozen men and women and was suspected of killing 40 others. Ness's failure to catch the killer and his unsuccessful bid to become mayor tarnished this national legend. During World War II, the Flats led the state as a producer of war products. Along with heavy manufacturing and shipbuilding, the Flats produced specialty war items such as prefab steel houses, aircraft parts, and napalm. Cleveland was flying high and even caught the attention of the New York Times Magazine.
Clevelanders display an exuberant enthusiasm for their town and their way of life, such as I don't recall ever noting in any city east of the Alleghenies. It really is remarkable, their town boosting, their local pride and contentment. L.H. Robbins.
By the 1940s, the manufacturing became so decentralized that the Flats was no longer Cleveland's #1 employer. You had the auto industries and, of course, during the war effort, the war industries, which were located throughout greater Cleveland. So the novelty of the Flats as an industrial center was diminishing. And then with the end of World War II, you had a major loss in population as GIs coming home were able to afford the GI loans and so forth and move into the suburban areas.
Many problems that plagued the Flats during the pre-Depression era returned. Poverty, pollution, crime, and residents' flight to new homes in the suburbs grew to unmanageable levels. Business leaders struggled with the problems, but answers eluded them. Everyone seemed to be leaving. The Flats became a sad, dirty, abandoned place where a few rough individuals patronized the taverns that were a staple of riverfront life. Even the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959 brought only limited and short-lived renewal. The good life was in the suburbs, and highways replaced rail and river transportation. Abandoned industrial plants, empty and gutted, were frequent targets for arson. The homeless wandered among the abandoned buildings. When it seemed the Flats could sink no lower, the seemingly impossible happened.
One of the more colorful events in Flats history was when the Cuyahoga River caught fire in 1969 down in the industrial area. The surface of the river, which was heavily polluted at the time, somehow ignited. And during that fire, 2 of the railroad bridges in the area were severely damaged. Unfortunately, that fire gained national fame and acclaim for the city of Cleveland. And it was mentioned on TV by everyone from Walter Cronkite to Johnny Carson. And of course, that fire was just a small event and really didn't reflect on the quality of life or the development of Cleveland in any way.
The Flats' misery tarred Cleveland's reputation, and the once proud center of industrial might became a national joke.
Roughly between 1950, I would say, and 1970, 1975, when there's nothing happening in the Flats that people sort of want to participate in. There are some saloons, for sure, but almost, and some industry, small industry, and then further down the big industrial complexes, but nothing really of substance in the Flats anymore until, the late 1960s and early 1970s, when urban development and the possibility that this is the lake and very close to the river and all the people are already downtown might be enticed to come 1 or 2 blocks down and over the plateau and into the river valley, and they gradually are enticed back.
So in '72, there was an article in one of the papers that stated that a junkyard was going to be placed upon this particular land that's on the riverfront. Now that land was where Moses Cleveland landed, so it was Cleveland's Plymouth Rock, you might say. And we had just gone through a disastrous public relations problem with the mayor hair catching on fire, which had just been preceded by the river catching on fire. And I decided that there was no way that I was going to permit the city to take another black eye of having a junkyard put on our Plymouth Rock. So I said to Jimmy Day, buy the property.
The Higbee Company envisioned a $17 million complex with shops, restaurants, and a Salvador Dali museum near Settlers Landing, where Moses Cleveland first arrived. The night before the National Furniture Warehouse building was to be turned over to Higbee's, an arsonist set fire to it. It burned for 4 days. The very heart of the complex was destroyed. To salvage the vision, Higbee's purchased the AOK Trucking Company building.
So we bought that, or leased that building and converted it into what we called the Cleveland Freight and Trucking Company. And we opened it up to the great acclaim of the whole city. We had, from almost day one, we had enormous crowds of young people coming down, waiting an hour to an hour and a half to get in, to dance at a disco, the first really upgraded disco in the city. That proved that there was a real demand. It proved to all kinds of people that the Flats was a safe area, that we had no particular problems.
And then it was a couple of years later that it dawned on them the best way to get people down here is by offering them a place to go, because there was really no place to go. You had to go to a bar or a restaurant, buy a drink if you wanted to see anything, and it was very crummy anyhow. So they had the idea of, let's get in a park where people can come for free. And that is the idea for a Heritage One. That was the first one that was put in. That became a project for the nation's bicentennial, and it was dedicated July 4th, 1976. They came to the park, and they came to other events that were scheduled, and found out how interesting it is here.
Industry continued to play its role in the Flats, even as the recreation and entertainment facilities grew. Steel plants merged. LTV Steel's Cleveland plant grew to be the second largest steel producer in the country. 1973 saw the final demise of the fishing industry, but fish processing continued to thrive. The plants imported and distributed over 5 million pounds of fish a year. Today, most of the lumber yards are gone, but the few that remain specialize, using saws from the mid-19th century for quality custom work. One of the area's newest industries is the Axo Salt Mine, located on one of the world's largest salt deposits. Shipping, Flour processing, milling, tool and die, paint, and high-tech industries now play a vital role in the life of the flats. The flats would enjoy a new vitality as abandoned industrial and warehouse space was renovated to accommodate retail, office, and entertainment uses.
Changes in demographics and industrial production techniques has freed up some of those industrial buildings for other uses, which has made the entertainment type uses possible to some extent in the flats. The city of Cleveland is also, over time, has not taken great advantage of either its lakefront or its river for public access. And that, I think, is part of the current resurgence of the flat.
The problem seemed insurmountable: cleaning up the river.
And one of the factors, one of the catalysts in this was the Cuyahoga River caught fire due to an excess of pollutants in it. And that was one of the impetus which caused the Congress to pass the laws which allowed us to go in there and have the authority to make it get cleaned up, and the dumping of these types of pollutants did cease. That the river was running black with pollutants, oil, that type of thing. You can look out here and see yourself now that the river looks fairly clean.
We're members of the Cuyahoga River Remedial Action Plan, which is a plan that we're involved with, as are other community groups involved with, under the guidance to develop a plan to make sure that Cuyahoga remains a clean and safe river. We've spent enormous amounts of money in the last 10 years, over $100 million on 10 current water treatment plants, and we have another one under construction. Plants that are designed to treat the water before it goes back into the river. We return water to the river cleaner than the water we get out of the river that is filtered through these plants.
Efforts paid off, and the water quality dramatically improved. The flats trembled on the edge of rebirth.
Investment occurred kind of slowly, and the interesting thing was this was all privately developed areas. There wasn't a whole lot of public coordination, wasn't any strategic planning that was done in the area. And as began to snowball and to occur, a number of developers really caught the eye of the area and really started to make investments. That took off a number of years ago on the West Bank with a developer named Jeff Jacobs, who made an initial investment in an establishment called Shooters. That then turned into a number of other subsequent developments, and then he created a boardwalk type of investment.
Nautica, a $65 million development, opened in 1987, transformed the West Bank of the Cuyahoga River into an entertainment, restaurant, office, retail, and boating complex.
There's quite a few factors, I think, that make Nautica special, and I think becoming as noteworthy and as successful nationally as it has. One, I think the intermix between industry that was here and that we've turned and created an entertainment district out of. I think to react to the entertainment side of that, I mean, to the success ratio that we've had down here, with Shooters being the first anchor tenant on the complex in 1987, which in the summers, July and August of '87 and '88 was the largest grossing restaurant in the country. Consequently, Club Coconuts being, and the Nautica stage being as popular as it was here locally for additional entertainment. And again, I think the flavor of the commercial versus entertainment was just a natural mesh. I mean, there's very few places in the world that you can see an art form the size of the Kinsman Independent or the American Republic come down the river away from you while you're enjoying a cocktail or having dinner at a riverside restaurant. And we've taken that, I think, and heightened it a little bit more, certainly with the boardwalk and some of the other activities we've done here in the powerhouse.
The centerpiece of the Nautica complex is the 1890s power generating plant used for railways and streetcar systems. It's called the powerhouse.
It was just used by residents for shelter and really just went in disrepair until Jeff acquired the property in the mid-1980s. And when Jeff made his first inspection, having acquired the property, walked through the building that had no roof, no floors. Many of the walls were dilapidated and crumbling. It was 6 feet of water in the basement with a dead body. And since that point, had taken it to hopefully heightened levels of entertainment and prosperity.
I think the thing about the Cleveland Flats that sets it apart is that it is such a major interreaction between so many different elements that it creates the fun, the excitement. To see the big ore boats go down through, the entertainment, somebody over on the beach playing volleyball or whatever they're doing. Now, when I look at areas like Faneuil Hall, Ghirardelli Square, Baltimore's waterfront, etc., they don't have this total mix. And it is that total mix that I think is really important. In the daytime, to see trucks down there working, have a business, and in the evening you see that place may be dark, but now the nightclubs are up. So the place is utilized day and night, and it just makes for excitement.
There were still growing pains. Problems between entertainment and industry grew in the new flats. Parking, traffic patterns, bridge repair, city services, and the young bar crowds all became issues.
We are concerned with safety. We are concerned with cleanliness, meaning trash, cans, bottles, that type of thing. We are also very interested in marketing the flats to northeastern Ohio and actually to the whole state of Ohio so that they understand that this is a place where families can come. It's not just bars and restaurants. We have ongoing that we try to promote. We have ongoing events that are geared towards families so that people can come down, they can bring their families. There's things for all ages, from the youngest to the senior citizens to do.
Recreational boating traffic on the Cuyahoga River has increased significantly since 1980, and you can just look around you here and see the evidence of that. Part of that has been due, of course, to the resurgence, increased economic growth in this particular area. Close to 10 years ago, the industrial aspect of it. So that's attracted more boaters. There's also been an increase, believe it or not, in vessel traffic on the Cuyahoga just in the last 6 years. There's been a rumor in the past that the shipping industry on the Great Lakes don't believe it.
The increased use of the river by pleasure boaters has levied more work on the Coast Guard.
Usually this hour, evening time, early evenings, afternoons, we mostly run into the family-oriented boater. You know, the guy takes out his kids and his wife for family boats and for family boat, and come down here to the flats, you know, for a cruise. And later on, as the evening goes on, it turns into your the more partier-oriented boater. Drunk boaters, the guys that pretty much belligerents.
I would say it's changing all the time, like everything else, and some left, When the entertainment people came, they wanted their properties and they got good prices for them, and I think that's great. On the other hand, there are a certain number of them, and we are one of those types of industries that cannot leave. We have 2 holes in the ground here that we can't move, and our neighbors have unloading facilities on the riverfront and leave the river for their commerce, and so we can't go. So these are the people who essentially joined flats industry, and we're the people who we have to learn to live with entertainment, and entertainment has to live with us. We can't live at the expense of each other.
With trendy restaurants, shops, and nightclubs already in the flats, upscale constructed on the hillsides overlooking the valley.
Our friends, and it's typical of the suburbs, they think that going downtown is you know, you're taking your life in your hands, and it's just not true. But they don't understand. You know, they've been out in Brecksville for all their lives, and they don't know what's going on downtown. They really don't. And you know, when they do come down, and we invite them down a lot, they sit out on the balcony, and they're all amazed at what a great view it is, with the boats coming up and down the river and that sort of thing. They really do.
In 1984, a group of citizens looking to promote and celebrate the revitalization of the flats came up with a concept for a festival called Riverfest. During the next 6 years, Riverfest would attract over 1 million people and the largest free festival in the country.
Riverfest really shoots for all age groups, and we very specifically target different events for different age groups. On Friday night, we have the Parade of Lights, one of the most favorite parts of the event. Really a family-oriented event. Families of all ages come down, from the old to the young, couples, and that attracts that kind of a crowd. It is followed by a fireworks display, which of course everybody likes. Saturday daytime, we open up our children's village. We have trout fishing, little rides for kids, all kinds of activities just for kids. At the same time, we start entertainment. As we get towards Saturday night, we gear our entertainment very much towards a rock and roll, 18 to 25, 18 to 35 crowd, continuing to have gearing towards an older crowd. Sunday, we go back to a total family, older crowd event with a crazy craft race.
The idea is just for fun, and they make boats out of milk cartons, and it started out on a smaller scale, but then the milk cartons have been added and added and added, and you know, we've had some pretty huge ones. It's one of the biggest events of the Riverfest. And it's a fun thing, and funny.
One of the guys started drawing it up early this spring. He scaled everything out so that we'd have enough flamboyancy to be able to have enough cartons to hold all the weights, and then they put all the instruments on it. It was really unique. I saw it going the other night. We had air compressors blowing up the confetti. We had a Santa Claus head come up in the air, and we decided we'd have Santa Claus throwing out candy
Services and the crowds that fill the streets. Music from local and national bands is presented on 5 stages. All kinds of people come to have a good time.
The kids! That has to be it. We like to play with them. They gotta smile, though. Yeah, that's what we charge for a balloon. They have to smile to get a balloon. But they're fun to play with, and they have all these great beliefs. If you ask them where clowns come from, they don't know, but they'll tell you the greatest places.
Well, I like to play in the streets, and I'm not sure that you can get away with it all the time in Cleveland, so I came down here because I had the chance to do it today.
I think this year it even looks bigger and better. It's really exciting. It's a way to show off Cleveland here in the waterfront.
As far as Cleveland is concerned, it, I think, has helped the general rebirth of Cleveland and the general image of Cleveland.
Nearly 200 years have passed since Moses Cleveland first set foot on the flats. The area has known the worst of times and the best, and now stands on the verge of a genuine rebirth. Confidence in the present and optimism for the future, the flats' life is linked inexorably to the rivers, and much remains to be done.
We're just starting. The flats is just starting to develop. This is not, you are not looking at a finished product in any way, shape, or form. We are in a growing phase here. We have trolleys to come yet. We have new developments going to be going on.
We're not done yet. We're not done yet.
We're happy with the stages that it's come to now. We have a very active association that's going to be looking at the progress and the future development of the Flats. Flats Oxbow Association does have a long-range development plan.
From our perspective, it's a tremendous success story. It also is news for us. As I mentioned, we want to continue to protect the industrial base. We want to continue to see development. We want housing to be a part of that development in the future. So it's been both a success and a challenge, and a large part of the future success, I think, depends on our ability to deal with some of those challenges.
Major challenges continue to face the Flats. Industry is hampered. Traffic, litter, beer bottles, vandalism, and other entertainment-related disadvantages. Economic and market pressures are encouraging smaller industries to relocate or close down. Industry, entertainment, and residential agree that the location is undoubtedly the chief advantage of the Flats.
The fact that there are ongoing industries that are active from very early in the morning, just that creative interplay between the tourist, the industrial worker, the user of a restaurant at lunchtime, the nighttime entertainment of the Flats. It's a very interesting mesh of people and activities, which gives us a unique flavor. It makes Cleveland unique, and it makes this nationally significant.
That's what the Flats is all about. It's not just mixed use, it's living it, it's seeing it, it's eating it, it's drinking it. That's what the Flats is in the city of Cleveland.